Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Sheridan fought the Battle of Five Forks and began the pursuit of Robert E. Lee's army. In this video, I'll bring an end to the war and dive into Sheridan's post-war life. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. During Sheridan's pursuit of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Little Phil came to the home of a middle-aged Southern man. The general sat on the step of the house, lit a cigar, and began to converse with the owner of the home, who sat in a chair on the porch. Sheridan asked if Lee's troops had passed by. The Southerner defiantly delivered a little speech about his loyalty to the Confederacy. After unrolling a map, Sheridan then asked how far away Buffalo Creek was. The man said he didn't know. Sheridan then asked how long the man had lived there. The reply came, "All my life." "Very well, sir, it's time you did know," Sheridan replied. The man was put under guard and walked the 5 miles to Buffalo Creek, all in his slippers. Through hard riding and the determination of their leader, Sheridan's cavalry got ahead of Robert E. Lee's army, ready to intercept them at Appomattox Station. Sheridan denied the Confederate army an avenue west and south, but Little Phil feared that Lee might try to break out and head to Lynchburg, a major location on the railroad. He hoped that more Union infantry could come to the station because he believed that if Lee determined to move through Appomattox Station, the cavalry alone couldn't stop the rebels. From April 8th to the morning of the 9th, Sheridan and his troops got little sleep, mostly staying under arms and facing east, ready to pounce on the retreating foe. Later that morning, Sheridan observed a white flag of truce. He began to ride toward Appomattox Court House, but came under fire. He waved his hat and yelled that there was a truce, but the firing continued. He ducked into a swell and followed it to the village. He soon ran into Confederate General John Brown Gordon. More firing could be heard by the Confederates, directed toward Sheridan's troops. Little Phil asked Gordon about the continued hostilities, then said, "We might as well let them fight it out." Gordon replied, "There must be some mistake." The firing eventually subsided. Gordon later commented about this interaction with Sheridan, writing, "While never discourteous, were far less agreeable and pleasing than those of any other officers of the Union Army whom it was my fortune to meet. There was an absence of that delicacy and consideration which was exhibited by other Union officers." Sheridan was despondent about the surrender. He wanted to utterly destroy the rebel army. He paced unhappily when some of Grant's staff approached him. Little Phil said, "I wish they had held out an hour longer, and I would have whipped hell out of them." Later, Sheridan held up a clenched fist and remarked, I've got 'em like that." As more details about the truce made it to all parties, Sheridan waited on the outskirts of the village. Grant came riding up, and pleasantries were exchanged. Grant asked if Lee was there, referring to the little community a short ride away. Sheridan replied that he was in a brick home just up the road. Grant replied, "Come, let us go over." At the Wilmer McLean home, Grant climbed the stairs with Sheridan, Orville Babcock, and Edward Ord. Inside the home, Sheridan was introduced to Lee. Then Sheridan left the room to wait on the porch as the two men, along with aides, helped draft the surrender. Once done, Sheridan returned to the parlor. Most officers treated Lee with reverence, except Sheridan. Sheridan asked Lee to return some dispatches sent to him that morning, protesting being fired upon by the rebels during the flag of truce. Sheridan had failed to make copies and wanted the originals. Lee reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the dispatches, and returned them, saying, "I am sorry. It is probable that my cavalry at that point of the line did not fully understand the agreement." Lee and Grant left the house, and Union officers began a bidding war for McLean's furniture. Sheridan bought the table where Grant drafted the terms for 2 $10 gold pieces. He then gave the table to one of his subordinates, George Armstrong Custer, to give to Custer's wife Libby, whom Sheridan had met on a steamer called the River Queen the previous July. Accompanying the gift was a note from Sheridan. "Permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring this about than your very gallant husband." The next day at 8 a.m., with other generals handling the surrender details, Sheridan marched his cavalry corps 4 abreast through the center of Appomattox Court House on his way east. At night, the horsemen camped in a very strange way, with outposts and pickets. The war's finality rudely began to set in. On his way to Petersburg, Sheridan encamped at Nottoway Court House. That night, a telegraph operator noticed a transmission destined for General George Meade, informing him that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Sheridan dismissed the report and went back to bed. He would soon find out its validity. When the Cavalry Corps made it to Petersburg, Sheridan was directed to take his horsemen and the 6th Infantry Corps to North Carolina to aid William T. Sherman in his attempt to destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Sheridan made it to South Boston, Virginia, before he got a message from Washington informing him that Sherman had accepted the surrender of that rebel army. The Blue Column began to retrace its steps back to Petersburg and then to Washington, D.C. When he got to the nation's capital, he found orders naming him commander of all U.S. troops west of the Mississippi River, with the role of bringing Texas and Louisiana back into the Union. Sheridan left his room at the Willard Hotel and walked quickly to see General-in-Chief Grant. Sheridan hoped that he could remain in Washington long enough to lead his cavalry corps in the grand review scheduled in a few days. Grant informed Sheridan that he must leave immediately, that the situation in Texas needed his attention. Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith commanded rebel troops in that area, and Mexico, particularly the Mexican government under Maximilian of France, was aiding the Confederacy. Sheridan needed to proceed to the Rio Grande and stop the rebel exodus and help the Mexicans opposing Maximilian, led by Benito Juarez. Sheridan left Washington, destined for St. Louis, then proceeded to New Orleans, Louisiana. But before reaching New Orleans, he got a telegram informing him that Smith had surrendered on May 26th. This solved one of Sheridan's objectives, but he still needed to secure the border. In New Orleans, he organized the forces under his command, numbering over 50,000 men, and dispersed them throughout Texas. He himself rode to the border and rattled his saber, demonstrating to the imperialists on the Mexican side that he intended to commence hostilities. William Seward, the Secretary of State, didn't want to bring about a war and urged diplomacy to solve the problems between the U.S. and the imperialist government in Mexico. Grant covertly told Sheridan to conduct a Cold War against Mexico. Sheridan went to work, spread misinformation to the Mexican side, arming Mexican insurgents, and moved his troops around to threaten Maximilian. The show of force worked, and the French imperialists withdrew troops from many points in northern Mexico. Juarez's presidential term ended in December 1865, which created a power vacuum within the Mexican Republican government. 3 men vied for the position, but Grant liked Jose Maria Carbajal. Grant told Sheridan to give him as much aid as he could, but regretted that he couldn't give him direct aid. Carbajal was quickly deposed, and Servando Canales attempted to take the reins. Unimpressed with either man, Sheridan put his support behind Juarez, the former president. A combination of Sheridan's aid to the insurgents and the expansion of Prussia in Europe convinced the French to pull their troops out of Mexico, and without the backing by France, Maximilian was deposed and executed by firing squad. Sheridan's political battles along the Mexican border gave way to political battles within the United States once Maximilian was gone. President Andrew Johnson and Congress fought bitterly over who would coordinate Reconstruction of the South. Sheridan noticed that when ex-Confederates regained political power in Louisiana, that the African Americans were at the mercy of a people who, recently their masters, now seemed to look upon them as the authors of all the misfortunes that had come upon the land. Texas became a lawless area as Sheridan's army size shrunk and the ex-Confederates began to take over the state governments in that state as well. When a reporter asked Sheridan how he liked Texas, he said, "If I owned hell in Texas, I would rent out Texas and live in hell." In mid-1866, Sheridan returned to New Orleans only to find that a violent event had occurred at the Mechanics' Institute, when whites had attacked a group of black and white men meeting to elect delegates for Louisiana's Constitutional Convention. Sheridan felt deeply for the newly freedmen. He wrote, "Their freedom had been given them, and it was the plain duty of those in authority to make it secure, and screen them from the bitter political resentment that beset them, and to see that they had a fair chance in the battle of life." Grant wrote to Sheridan and asked him some questions that President Johnson wanted answered about the riot in New Orleans. Sheridan pointed the finger at general uneasiness across the city and the state, and singled out a judge who gave the perpetrators assurance that nothing judicial would happen to them in its aftermath. When Johnson released part of Sheridan's report, it turned many of the ex-Confederates even more against Sheridan and the federal authorities. Sheridan felt as though Johnson had a vendetta against him. Congress took charge of Reconstruction and established 5 military districts to govern the southern states. Sheridan was placed in command of the 5th Military District, overseeing Texas and Louisiana. Before March 1867 ended, Sheridan issued General Orders No. 1 to Louisiana and Texas. It made clear that the military now wielded veto power over all civilian government actions. Sheridan proceeded to remove the New Orleans judge and 2 elected officials whom he had long had in his sights for their roles in the riot. He had the authority for these actions under yet another supplemental Reconstruction Act, again passed over Johnson's veto, permitting district military commanders to remove any civil official who impeded Reconstruction. Sheridan stretched his authority to cover many aspects of civil life. He got rid of disloyal officials. He integrated public transportation, and he helped put former Union soldiers in as police officers. When the Louisiana governor got under Sheridan's skin by obstructing his Reconstruction objectives, he replaced him with someone else. Sheridan grew to despise the ex-rebels. He wrote, "If I am disliked, it is because I cannot and will not cater to rebel sentiment. It was of no consequence to him whether the Southern states were readmitted tomorrow or kept out for 20 years. The more I see of these people, the less I see to admire." Texas was also under Sheridan's thumb. When Galveston wanted to hold a funeral for Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston as they brought the remains to Austin for burial, Sheridan overruled the parade. When the town's citizens paid homage by marching in silence, Sheridan removed the town's mayor. Sheridan reported to Grant about Texas that the condition of freemen and Union men in remote parts of the state is truly horrible. The government is denounced, the freedmen are shot, and Union men are persecuted if they have the temerity to express their opinion. My own opinion is that the trial of a white man for the murder of a freeman in Texas would be a farce. Because of violence against Unionist blacks and Federal soldiers, Sheridan removed the Texas governor complicit in those actions and put in place a Unionist governor. Sheridan's actions got the attention of the president, who in turn ordered the removal of Sheridan from that military district and reassigned him to the Department of the Missouri. Johnson declared that Sheridan's rule over Texas and Louisiana has in fact been one of absolute tyranny without reference to the principles of our government or the nature of our free institutions, a resort to authority not granted by law. He reported to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in August 1867, but took a few months of leave to visit family and friends, then went to Washington, D.C. to work with General William T. Sherman in putting together the Army Code of Regulations and Articles of War. He left the capital in February 1868, destined for Fort Leavenworth. In this department, Sheridan would be dealing with Native Americans rather than ex-Confederates. The Medicine Lodge Treaty signed between the United States and multiple tribes would relocate numerous tribes to the Indian Territory, and the government would give them supplies. When some relocated, they ended up starving because Congress was delayed in ratifying the treaty, thus no food was sent to the groups. Some tribes began to lash out against white settlers, and some formed hunting parties to prevent their starvation. Some, like the Cheyenne, began to attack white settlers. Their dog soldiers would become the main target for Sheridan. He got permission from Sherman to forcibly remove the tribes to the reservations and to attack the perpetrators of atrocities on the frontier. To catch the Indians unaware, Sheridan planned a winter expedition to attack their encampments. As usual, Sheridan planned incredibly well. He studied weather patterns in previous years to know what to expect and consulted scouts and frontiersmen to guide his strategy in assaulting the camps of various tribes, but particularly the Cheyenne. In November 1868, Sheridan let loose his subordinate George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry on a village where Chief Blackkettle was staying. The chief and many men, women, and children were killed in the raid planned by Sheridan and perpetrated by Custer. Although it gets the name of the Battle of Washita, it resembled more of a massacre. Sheridan visited the village after the battle and intended on attacking more villages. He received information that 2 chiefs, Satanta and Lone Wolf, were nearby and would agree to meet with him. Sheridan rode to the Kiowa village where the 2 men were, along with 2,000 cavalry, to impress upon them the power Sheridan had. Little Phil declared, "I am now your chief, and you must obey me. I am just as much your chief as you are the chiefs of your people." Sheridan's words and imposing army convinced both chiefs to become cooperative, agreeing to move to Fort Cobb. However, groups from the tribe began to leave, and soon only a handful remained to travel to the fort. Sheridan caught Satanta and Lone Wolf, holding them at Fort Cobb. Sheridan made a declaration that if the tribe didn't come to the fort within 48 hours, he would execute the two chiefs. It was a nerve-wracking 2 days for both men, but the Kiowas began to return. Sheridan rounded up other tribes with the threat of annihilation, gaining fear from the various Native American groups, but with his own men, he had gained a great respect. One man admired him for camping in a tent when the weather was fair or foul, marching at our head in snow and rain, enduring all the hardships of wind and weather. He is not a young man, either between 35 and 40 years old. At the end of this campaign, he had subdued multiple tribes, and a shining endorsement awaited him. President-elect Ulysses S. Grant informed Sheridan that upon his inauguration as president, Sheridan would be promoted to lieutenant general, and William T. Sherman would go on to replace Grant as the general of all U.S. forces.